suppose here's the tricky bit. Is there any common ground? And perhaps the first that I thought is, can we actually agree on what needs fixing in the current system?
I suspect we all, I mean, there's probably lots of things we don't agree on in terms of fixing things in the current system, but I suspect we probably all don't like the 60, 70, 80% effective marginal tax rates creating a poverty trap for people earning in the range of $10,000 to $30,000.
Yep, I think that's a bad thing, definitely.
Sure. And what would it take to fix that? Who do we have to convince?
Negative income tax.
You either need to give less welfare to the people without a job or more welfare to the people with a job, or both.
All right.
I mean, in the US, we have this earned income tax credit, and that basically is part of the idea of that.
Right.
It is, try to subsidize people, pay them a little extra when they get that first dollar of income. The government chips in a bit more, right? And that does encourage people to enter the labor market. That's very clear. The problem, again, is that you eventually have to claw back at some stage. And I know that John will say, oh, well, it's less than. At some stage, you have to claw it back, wherever it is. By $40,000 a year, you've clawed it all back in your world. So it really goes into the details. You have to draw out the budget constraint and figure out, well, where are all the kinks and where are people going to bunch and how can I minimize this effect, right? But it will be there no matter what. We just have to distribute it in some way that's as minimally disruptive as possible, right? And I think we could probably agree about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think don't know whether we'll agree on this or not, but I do think we talk a lot about the problem of the welfare system. We don't talk enough about the problem of the labour market. We're going to come out better from this crisis partly because we've got some decent protections around workers and decent protections around arbitration and conciliation, whereas that's why the US is going to come out much worse than we are, despite how much money they're throwing at it. Lots of people are going to lose their job, right? So we've got a reasonable labour market, but there's still lots of issues that would need to be addressed. We are still heavily casualised, and that's likely to increase. So, some form of way in which people are both, we have this problem of overemployment, underemployment. People who've got salary jobs are working longer hours, people who want more hours can't get enough. And so UBI is perhaps part of a plank of a way in which we can address some of those issues, but we should also be having a conversation about how do we think about redistributing paid working hours and some of those proposals, for example. It's not a silver bullet, it has to be with a whole bunch of other things.
I've got one idea that I definitely want to say before we finish, but just before I come to that, I wonder, you said before that your version of a UBI is a long-term plan, understandable. And you mentioned a few short-term stepping stones. Would you think something like what I've been talking about could be a stepping stone, or would it be a regressive step in your mind?
A negative income tax?
At the levels that I've been talking about, so like $1,000 a month, so $12,000 a year, and then the tax rate of 30% above that, so the effective marginal tax rate comes down to 30%.
I mean, I think in terms of that proposal, it makes sense in terms of addressing the problems of the effective marginal tax rates. The negative income tax, works depending on what level you set it at before people start to lose. If you said it's $15,000 and you earn $7,000, then you'll get an $8,000 effectively a tax credit. That's okay, but for me, the rate payment has to be generous enough to address the poverty issue, right? And I don't know whether that would do it because it does rely on people having to get that part-time paid work. And also enough that it increases both exit and voice for workers. Because I think that's the societal dimension to this, potentially in the labour market, is that it changes the relationship between capital and labour depending on what rate the UBI is paid. So people may not need to be driven to dangerous and dirty jobs. Employers might create jobs that are actually attractive. And this is the ecological argument. I don't know whether we agree on this or not, but there is an ecological argument made for UBI as well, in the sense that, people could be in the same way in which we did in COVID. If there's less mobility for workers, transport and housing are really big contributors to greenhouse gases, then you could foster a localism and a little bit of this way in which we thought about slow food, a little bit of that slow time movement, for example, right? So it could be consistent with an ecological imperative. But that, again, would need to test that effect in terms of putting it in place. But
sure,
it's got to be, for me, it's got to address poverty.
Yeah,
it can't be low enough.
Fair enough. I think you saw that one coming.
One other area we might agree on, I'm not sure, is that the problems of poverty are multifaceted, multidimensional, not just about money. And John, you haven't really talked too much about what you would do with people who can't find a job. But I might suggest that maybe you would support programs that would try to integrate them more with their communities, to try to link them with employers, to try to maybe provide the kinds of resources that they would need to try to send out resumes or go to interviews or whatever the thing is that they need to do. And I think this is just a very, very difficult problem to solve, particularly in remote communities, and it's not helped by the layers of administration to access our existing transfer system that we haven't even spoken about today, but often comes up in discussions of UBI, which is, well, we have all this machinery you have to liaise with and go through in order to even access any money, and why do we have to have that? How about we just give everybody a check? And I actually think that is an argument for some kind of simplification, and whether we make that into an argument for a national bank where people can just get money added automatically without having to prove something, or whether we say, look, there are no work search tests for the first 2 years, or whatever we say, but something that helps people to more easily integrate with the systems that are trying to help them and the labor market where we ultimately do want them to be, of course. I agree with you, John, about that. So some sort of community-based, because you like community, networking, assistance, support, I don't know whether to call it charity or government, philanthropy.
So the point you were making about the conditionality is a good one, and I think that's probably something that if we could make it work, we'd all have a bit of sympathy. At the moment, the approach to disincentivizing people to take welfare seems to be offer them New Start and then make their life as miserable as possible and hope that stops them taking it out. So New Start's currently worth $15,000 a year, and I'm making this number up coming, but imagine that the hassle that they're doing, that the cost of the hassle on people taking out New Start. If that to them is $3,000 worth of disutility, offering them no hassle and giving them $12,000 leaves them just as well off and saves us all $3,000 a person, which we can use on boosting the welfare for the working poor instead. So maybe there's some agreement there. In terms of community welfare, I think, Murray, you'll have to do a whole other session for that. It's a topic that I love ranting about, but I need a few hours on a soapbox for that one. But yes, I've got a big interest in finding innovative community-based solutions to how to help people. I've got a bugbear about the idea that people have in their mind, if you want to help people, it must be through government. You vote once every 3 years, and that's the end of your duty. You walk away and think you've done good. I think it's much better to... I think it's more effective to help solve underlying problems through community welfare programs and connections. But that's a huge topic.